The morning they discharged me from Cedar Ridge Recovery Hospital, I had exactly $51 in my wallet, a paper pharmacy envelope full of pills I could barely pronounce, and a canvas tote with the clothes I had worn into the emergency room 7 weeks earlier. I stood just outside the sliding glass doors under a sky the color of wet cement and called my daughter for the 5th time. Straight to voicemail. Her recorded voice came on bright and cheerful, the voice of a woman who still sounded young in a message, even though life had already done enough to age her. It told me to leave my name and number. I did not leave one. I had already left 2 earlier that morning and 1 the night before. There is a point at which another message stops being communication and becomes pleading, and I have never had much talent for pleading. So I lowered the phone, sat down on the metal bench near the entrance, and watched a small brown bird peck at something near the curb. I remember thinking, with a bitterness that surprised me, that even a bird knew how to leave a place under its own power. My son-in-law answered on the second ring. "Hello? I need a ride," I said. "They're releasing me today." There was a pause, and then I heard the faint noise of a television in the background. A game show, maybe. Bright voices. Applause. "Grace is tied up right now," he said. "I told her yesterday. And Monday." Another pause. "We've got a lot happening over here, Tom. You might want to call a car service." Then he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand for a while after that. Then I pulled the money from my wallet and counted it again, not because I thought the amount had changed, but because counting money sometimes gives a man the feeling he is still in conversation with reality. $51. The nearest town with a reliable car service was nearly 20 miles away. My place sat another 24 beyond that, out on County Road 12, where the map started becoming more suggestion than promise. I had already done the math. Even if I got as far as town, I would still be stranded short of home. I want you to understand something before I go further. I am not a man who cries easily. I was raised in Western Virginia by a father who believed tears were a kind of self-indulgence, and though I have spent most of my life trying not to resemble him in the wrong ways, some lessons sink in deeper than a man intends. I did not cry when my wife died 12 years ago. I did not cry in the stroke unit when the neurologist used words like impairment and rehabilitation and slid a packet of papers toward my daughter while I lay there trying to remember whether my left hand had always felt that far away. I did not cry during 7 weeks of speech therapy and balance exercises and relearning simple tasks that had once belonged so fully to muscle memory I never even honored them with thought. But sitting on that bench in clothes that hung loose because I had lost nearly 20 pounds, with a phone gone quiet and no clear way to get home, I came very close. The doors slid open behind me. A man in a charcoal overcoat came out and sat at the far end of the bench. He looked down at his phone, then up at the lot, then back at me. I barely noticed him at first. I was still considering whether pride had become too expensive, and whether I ought to go back inside and ask the front desk if they had some kind of transport assistance program for abandoned old men too embarrassed to name themselves that way. Then he spoke. "Sir," he said gently, "I'm sorry to ask this, but are you Thomas Avery?" I turned and looked at him properly. He was maybe 52, well-kept, with silver at the temples and the kind of composure people pay for in expensive careers. But his hands were trembling slightly, not with age, with feeling, the kind of feeling a person is trying to keep folded small. "Yes," I said, "I am." He stood up so quickly it startled me. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "My name is Daniel Price." I frowned. The name moved through memory without quite arriving. He gave me a small, almost disbelieving smile. "In 1994, he said, "you let me sleep on your sofa for nearly a month and your wife made me eggs every morning before work." That did it. The memory came back all at once. Not cleanly, but with force. A younger man standing on my porch in February. Thin, embarrassed. A friend of my old neighbor, Mrs. Blevins, had sent him. He had lost his job at a machine shop and then lost the room he was renting 2 weeks later. He was 21 and too proud to go to a shelter. I had a pull-out sofa in the den. My wife, June, had put clean blankets on it before I had fully finished saying yes. "Danny," I said. His face changed then, just at the edges. Something softened and broke at once. He sat back down, closer this time. "I've looked for you before," he said. "A few times over the years. I drove past your old place on Walnut Street maybe 6 years ago. Someone else lived there. I never could track down where you'd gone." "We moved after June passed," I said. "Out by Blackwater Ridge. Been there 11 years now." He nodded. Then his eyes dropped to the canvas tote, the oversized coat, the cash still in my hand because I had forgotten to put it away. "What happened?" he asked quietly. There are moments when a man discovers he has already been stripped past the point where pride is useful. That was one of them. So I told him. Not every detail. Not at first. But enough. I told him about the stroke. About waking on the kitchen floor with half my words missing and my left side no longer answering to me the way it should. About the ambulance, the clot, the hospital in Roanoke. Then Cedar Ridge, where they taught me how to button my shirt again and climb 3 steps without swaying and say Tuesday without hearing Thursday come out instead. I told him my daughter had been attentive in the beginning, how she came the first week with forms and concern and casseroles from church ladies and a firmness that looked like love, and how that attention had gradually thinned over the next month into excuses, shorter visits, postponed calls, things coming up. I did not tell him everything about my son-in-law yet. Some truths arrive better when laid down in order. When I finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" "My own house," I said. "If I can get there, I'll take you." "You don't need to do that." His expression changed in a way I recognized immediately because my wife used to wear it whenever I was being foolish in a familiar direction. "Yes," he said, "I do." He drove a dark sedan so quiet I could barely hear the engine. The seats were warm. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and coffee. I sat in the passenger seat with my tote between my knees and watched the November hills slide by in shades of gray and bare brown. The trees had mostly surrendered their leaves. The ridgelines looked like sleeping animals under the sky. I had always loved that part of Virginia. June and I had moved there from Lynchburg when our daughter was 8 because we wanted space, land, a porch wide enough for evening coffee, a place where a girl could run without someone else's fence interrupting the thought. "What do you do?" I asked after 20 minutes, because I had been talking about myself, and old men ought to have the decency to notice when they are doing that. Daniel smiled. "I'm an attorney," he said. "Probate, estate planning, elder law, asset protection. Not glamorous, but useful." I sat with that. "You did all right for yourself." He laughed softly. "I used your $200 to pay my enrollment fees at community college, and the rest bought gas and groceries until my first check came in." I looked out the window for a second before answering. June would have liked hearing that. He glanced at me. "I'm sorry she isn't here." When we pulled into my driveway at Blackwater Ridge, he got out with me. He carried my tote up the porch steps while I fumbled with my key in the lock longer than I should have. My left hand still worked badly when I was cold or tired, and I was both. When I finally got the door open, the smell inside hit me immediately. Closed-up air, dust, old coffee. That peculiar loneliness houses develop when no one moves through them for too long. I had asked my daughter to check on the place, 3 times. No one had. The mail was scattered inside the door where it had fallen through the slot week after week. Utility notices, pharmacy reminders, grocery flyers, a handwritten church card. Daniel bent and helped me gather it. That was when he found the envelope. It was from a law office in Lexington. I did not recognize the name. I opened it at the kitchen table while Daniel stood across from me. The letter was written in the polished, neutral language lawyers use when they are trying to make something predatory sound procedural. Its meaning, once stripped of manners, was plain enough. My residence had been identified as a potentially relevant asset in relation to future care planning, and my designated healthcare representative had opened preliminary discussion concerning long-term guardianship options and residential liquidation scenarios. I read it twice. Then I handed it to Daniel. He read it once, folded it neatly, and asked, "When did your daughter become your healthcare proxy?" I rubbed my forehead. "At the hospital, I think. There were papers. They said it was standard. Did you sign anything else? Power of attorney? Financial delegation? Property authority?" I thought about it. There had been papers. A lot of them. Too many. I had still been slow then. Foggy. Tired in that deep post-stroke way that makes every page feel like weather. My son-in-law had been in the room handing me documents one at a time, talking fast, sounding efficient. My daughter had been there too, but mostly by the window, answering texts. "I don't know," I said at last. "Maybe." Daniel slipped the letter into his coat pocket. Then he looked me straight in the face. "I need you to trust me for a few days." I looked at him. Really looked. The boy from my old sofa. The man in my kitchen. The attorney holding what might be the first honest explanation of my circumstances. "I do," I said. What I did not yet understand, what I would not fully understand until 2 evenings later when Daniel sat across from me at my own kitchen table with coffee, legal pads, and copies of documents spread in careful rows, was how long this had likely been building. My son-in-law had been patient. That is the word I will use, though I mean something darker than patience. He and my daughter had been married 12 years. His name was Eric Morrow. He worked in real estate development and spoke about land the way some men speak about women, appraisingly, with a tone that pretends admiration while calculating leverage. I had never fully trusted him, but I kept that distrust in the same private drawer where I kept most of my stronger feelings. My daughter loved him, or believed she did. I told myself that was enough. My place on Blackwater Ridge sat on 5¼ acres in a county where prices had been climbing for nearly a decade. I had bought it for $160,000. According to the market reports Daniel pulled, it was now worth just under $480,000. I had not known that. I had been living there, not valuing it. There's a difference. Daniel laid out the paperwork slowly. A broad, durable power of attorney. A property authorization rider. Healthcare directives that gave more interpretive room than I would ever have knowingly granted. Everything signed during that hazy third week after the stroke, when I still needed people to repeat themselves and sometimes lost the thread of a sentence halfway through hearing it. "Can this be challenged?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "especially given your condition at the time, the lack of independent review, and the fact that the people benefiting from the documents were involved in presenting them." I sat back. "My daughter," I said. "Did she know?" He was quiet a moment. Then he said carefully, "People in difficult marriages often know less than outsiders assume, and more than they admit to themselves." That answer told me plenty. I had watched Grace over the years become gradually quieter. Not in obvious ways, in household ways. She checked with Eric before agreeing to dinners. She softened opinions halfway through stating them. She laughed, then looked toward him, as if waiting to see whether the laugh had cost too much. I had noticed it all and named none of it, because fathers tell themselves many cowardly things in the name of staying out of their children's marriages. Daniel stayed the first night because the heat had been off too long, and he did not think I should be alone while the house warmed up. The second morning, I came into the kitchen and found coffee made, toast on a plate, and legal strategies laid out across my table in blocks of tidy handwriting. June would have liked him enormously. My daughter called that afternoon. I answered on the third ring. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I'm home. A pause. About the ride, she said. Things got complicated. I'm sure they did. More silence. Are you managing okay? Do you need anything? I thought about the letter from Lexington, the property language, the signatures I barely remembered giving. I've got some help, I said. What kind of help? An old friend. 3 hours later, she called again. I didn't answer. Daniel and I were on the phone with a paralegal pulling hospital witness logs. She called twice more that evening. On the fourth call, I picked up. Who is staying there with you? She asked. The change in her tone told me she was no longer calling from her own concern alone. Someone else's concern had entered the line. His name is Daniel Price, I said. He's a lawyer. He's helping me review some paperwork. The silence that followed had a very specific texture. Not surprise. Fear. Dad, she said at last, you don't need a lawyer right now. You need rest. Reviewing paperwork is restful compared to rehab. She asked if she could come over the next day. I said yes. She arrived alone, which I noticed immediately. That either meant she had chosen not to bring Eric or had not been allowed to decide. I was not yet sure which. She looked tired. Thinner than when I had last seen her at week 4 of rehab, when she stayed 38 minutes and spent half of them checking messages. She looked like a woman who had not slept properly in a long time. She looked like June around the eyes, and that still undid me a little every time. Daniel took his laptop out to the porch and left us alone in the kitchen. I poured coffee for her. That is what my mother did for hard conversations, and June perfected into something near sacred. You put coffee in front of people as a way of saying, I'm still here. Let's tell the truth if we can. Grace wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking. I need to explain, she said. All right. What followed took nearly an hour. It came out in pieces. Not because she meant to deceive me, but because pain rarely knows how to move in straight lines. She told me about the weeks after my stroke, the panic, the paperwork, the calls, the way Eric had stepped forward and taken over, how grateful she had felt at first to have someone who seemed to know what to do. She said she had trusted him. She said she had signed what he told her to sign without reading it carefully. She said she had not understood the implications of the documents. She said she had never seen the Lexington letter. I watched her face the whole time. I know my daughter's face. I know when she lies. She was not lying. She was doing something harder than lying. She was realizing in real time that the structure she had trusted her whole adult life had been built to make her trust costly. He told me the legal inquiries were routine, she said, that every family in this situation had to consider options. I'm 67, I said, not 97. I had a stroke, not an erasure. She flinched. I know. And she did. I could see the recognition moving through her like winter light, slow, unwelcome, impossible to dismiss once noticed. For one strange little second, she almost smiled. You're not old, she said softly. There she was, my girl, the one who used to argue with me about baseball and call me at 10:30 at night just to read me some ridiculous thing she had found online. Not gone, just quieted too long. Daniel came back inside after a while and, at Grace's request, walked her through exactly what he had found. No anger, no speeches, just facts. He has the courtroom gift of separating what happened from what people later claim it meant. Grace asked smart questions. Focused questions. Questions that reminded me she had once been the sharpest kid in every room and might still be if she ever got enough oxygen to become herself again. Eric called her 3 times during that conversation. She did not answer. What came after was not one dramatic explosion. It was a slow accumulation. Daniel filed to challenge the power of attorney based on my medical impairment at signing and the surrounding circumstances. In the course of doing that, he uncovered other things. A title inquiry on my property initiated before my discharge date. A home equity assessment request. a file sent to a closing office Eric had used on other deals. Nothing was hidden exactly. It was just buried beneath trust and timing. Grace moved into my guest room 2 weeks later. She said it was temporary, just until she figured things out. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. I changed the sheets myself before she arrived. Fresh sheets matter more than people think. They say what words often cannot. You are safe here. Eric called me once during that period. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. He began controlled and ended insulted. He called me ungrateful, which I found almost impressive in its audacity. He said Daniel was manipulating a vulnerable man for access to future assets. He said I had turned Grace against him. I told him no. I had only made sure she had information. Then he said something about Daniel not being family. I thought of February 1994, of my old sofa, of June frying eggs at 6:30 in the morning for a young man too ashamed to meet my eyes. So I said, Daniel Price drove 30 miles to pick me up from a rehab center because 31 years ago I told him to come inside out of the cold. Make of that whatever you like. Then I hung up. Daniel started driving down from Lexington on weekends after that. He had clients in Roanoke and Bristol often enough to make it plausible, but I knew that was not the whole reason. We developed a rhythm. Football on Saturdays, steak or soup depending on weather, long conversations about property law, old baseball, tomatoes, and the strange humiliations of growing older in a country that treats usefulness like a moral category. Grace joined those dinners more often than not. He was careful with her. That is the word. Careful. Not indulgent, not cold. Just careful in the way one is with someone recovering from an injury they are only beginning to admit exists. One evening in December after dinner, the three of us sat in the kitchen with coffee and the last of a pecan pie one of the church women had brought by. Grace looked at Daniel and asked, "Why are you really doing all this? You don't owe Dad anything." He turned his mug slowly in his hands. Then he said, "In 1994, I was 21 years old. I had lost my room and my job inside 10 days. Mrs. Blevins told me there was a man on Walnut Street who might help me. I expected a phone number, maybe a lecture. Your father opened the door and said, 'Come on in, it's freezing.'" He paused. "Your mother had the sofa made up before I had my shoes off." Grace looked at me. I remembered that exactly. I remembered June giving me that little look over her shoulder as she tucked in the blanket corners, the one that meant you did the right thing without making a production of it. Daniel went on. He didn't ask me what mistake I'd made. He didn't ask me whether I deserved help. He just let me stay until I could stand up again. He set down his mug. "So no," he said. "I don't owe him. I chose him." Grace was quiet a long time after that. The legal matter resolved early in the new year. The power of attorney was invalidated. The property inquiries collapsed without authority behind them. Eric retained counsel. There were letters exchanged, then more letters, then silence. The kind of silence lawyers call progress and families call grief. Grace filed for divorce in February. I did not celebrate that. Let me be clear. There is nothing to celebrate in the death of a marriage, even a bad one. There is only untangling and pain and the humiliation of realizing how much of your life you built around someone who was using your trust as material. She cried a great deal that winter. Not theatrically, not continuously, just honestly, in waves. And I sat with her through it. My father would not have known how to do that. He would have mistaken presence for weakness, listening for indulgence. I know better because June taught me better. Sitting with someone's grief is not agreement. It is not surrender. It is simply what love looks like when there is nothing practical left to fix that day. By March, Grace had found a small apartment 25 minutes away. She came for dinner twice a week and called every other evening. Through the spring, I watched her return to herself in increments. Her opinions came back first, then her laugh, Then that old habit of disagreeing with me about baseball with far more confidence than evidence. Daniel filed the final property protections in April and then insisted on taking me to the best steakhouse in 3 counties to celebrate, which mostly meant we ate too much and talked until the staff began stacking chairs around us. I told him across the table, "I ought to pay you for all this." He looked at me and said, "I believe the phrase you used with me once was, 'Don't be stupid.'" I laughed so hard I surprised myself. "No," I said, "that sounds more like June." He grinned. "Maybe, but the principle was shared. What happens sometimes, if you are very lucky, is that a person enters your life in one form and returns decades later in another, and somewhere along the way, the connection matures without asking anyone's permission. By then, Daniel had become part of the structure of my weeks. He started calling Sunday evenings, which had once been June's time with me, and then had become an empty stretch of day I learned to fill with chores and television and the kind of silence that pretends to be peace. We talked about work, weather, law, aging parents, my tomatoes, his impossible clients, Grace's progress, old stories, new worries. In May, he told me he had been thinking about opening a small satellite office in the county. Estate planning, elder law. The nearest real services were too far for most older people, and there was need enough to justify the effort. He said he'd need only 1 room. I told him the front room off my porch got excellent morning light. There was a pause. "Tom," he said, "that is your house." "It is," I agreed. "And it has a room in it." He sighed into the phone. "You are impossible." "No," I said. "I'm from a family that knew how to lend a barn. A room is less than a barn." He used the room. By summer, there was a modest sign near the road. Daniel Price, attorney at law. By appointment. Twice a week, older couples and worried sons and recently widowed daughters came through my front gate and sat in that bright room discussing wills, deeds, healthcare directives, protections, fears. I brought coffee when it seemed right. Sometimes I sat in the kitchen listening to the murmur of his voice through the wall and thought about the difference between someone who sees property as leverage and someone who sees it as shelter. Eric had looked at my land and seen a price. Daniel looked at it and saw the tomato rows, the old swing June used to read in, the hydrangeas she planted by the fence that still bloomed every August, whether or not anyone praised them for it. That is the difference, I think, between valuing things and valuing people. I do not tell this story because I believe I did something noble in 1994. I did not. A young man was cold. I had a sofa. June had extra blankets and more decency than either of us ever needed to name out loud. The $200 came from our emergency jar, and we both agreed his emergency qualified. That was all. But I have thought often since my stroke about the way small acts travel. How a made-up sofa in February becomes community college, then law school, then a man in a dark overcoat sitting down beside you outside a rehabilitation center because something about your face was familiar. How eggs and coffee and a little dignity can move through 3 decades and return as rescue when you did not know you had anything left to collect. June used to say kindness was a form of faith. Not religious faith, though she had that too. She meant faith in the idea that doing the right small thing mattered whether or not the world ever acknowledged it. She was not foolish about this. She knew some kindness disappears without echo. She knew not every generosity returns. That never altered her opinion. "The point isn't whether it comes back," she told me once. "The point is whether it leaves your hands honestly." I understand that better now than I did then. I am 67 years old. I had a stroke. My left hand still fumbles when the weather turns cold. I have 5¼ acres that still belong to me, a daughter who now calls me on Tuesdays and Fridays without fail, and a bright front room where people come to protect what they built. I do not have June. That absence remains what it is. You do not heal from that kind of loss so much as learn the altered shape of your life around it. But I do have, in the place where I once believed only blood counted, something else. A chosen family. Not lesser, just chosen. Built from repeated decisions. A door opened in winter. A sofa offered without interrogation. A kitchen table shared. Fresh sheets. Coffee set down before difficult truths. A man deciding that 31 years is not too long a distance to honor a kindness. Grace asked me recently what I hoped people would take from all this. She has started writing, which feels like another part of her returning. I thought about the answer longer than she expected. Then I said, "Tell them it doesn't have to be big." She waited. "The thing you do for someone," I said. "It doesn't have to be dramatic. A meal, a room, a ride. Paperwork explained clearly. Most of what saves people comes in ordinary sizes." She wrote that down. I think June would have approved. She would probably have smiled that quiet smile of hers and told me I was finally saying out loud what I had always known and been too stubborn to phrase. She would have been right. She usually was.